everyone. Welcome to Web TV Focus, brought to you by Web TV. And our theme for this conversation is Buhari's debt legacy, high expenditure, low revenue. What must the Tinubu administration do to get Nigeria out of debt? I'm your host, Yemisi Landre-Ido. A big welcome to all of you joining us via Twitter Spaces. And you can also watch this conversation live on YouTube as well as Facebook. So join us on any of these platforms at WebTVNG on Twitter, at WebTV-NG on Facebook, and at WebTVNG on YouTube. Please make your contributions count as we go on this conversation. Now, to have a robust conversation as well as profile solutions, I'm joined by contributors of repute and authorities on the matter. Now we welcome the Director, Market Development Department, DMO, Monday Usaide, joins me via Twitter. Also joining us is the Senior Research and Policy Analyst, Budgitng, Vayala Kwaga. We also have joining us all on Twitter this morning, the Deputy Director, Serap Nigeria, as well as the Resident Representative, IMF Nigeria Office, Ari Eisen. Thank you all for joining me. And I have a lady with me in the studio. She's a senior, the Economist, rather, Ademidu Shogo with Proshare. Thank you so much, Ademidu. So let's have a brief foundation to all of this story here. So for us to have, as I said earlier, for us to have a robust conversation on this, to give us a background of what's happening. Now, upon assumption of office, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari inherited a debt profile of approximately $10.32 billion in 2015, but is leaving behind a total debt of about 77 trillion naira. That's where we are. The federal government incurred these debts via borrowings from the World Bank, the Ways and Means loans, the IMF, AFDB as well. Now, for those who don't know the meaning of Ways and Means is how a government incurs debt by borrowing funds from the country's central bank. The Ways and Means loans are currently estimated at 22.7 trillion naira, while that of the World Bank grew from $6.29 billion in 2015 to $13.46 billion in 2022. The country's public total debts, excluding Ways and Means, have risen sharply over the last decade, up from 12.60 trillion in 2015 to 46.25 trillion in 2022. Now, there is some concern about the country's difficulty to get external loans, as well as Ways and Means practice, especially as questions are being raised over the central bank's autonomy to be able to turn down the demand if it sees it as unnecessary or harmful to the economy. Once again, I welcome you all, and that was the foundation for this discussion. So let me begin with you, Ademidu Shogo. I've given a background. Where are we at from facts and figures?
Okay. Thank you for having me here again. Okay, let's start from how the trend of the debt has been. So we have a debt around 10 trillion. Yeah, 10 trillion has risen so much. It's around 46 trillion. That is just the debt, excluding the Ways and Means. So, like you earlier explained, the meaning of Ways and Means, that's the borrowing from CDN. Yeah, it has increased so much. It was at 22.7 trillion. Yes, and we are trying to convert that into a 9% point. So, after converting that into a 9% point, that means that the total volume of our country's debt is now around some 7 trillion. That's excluding the borrowings we are going to do this year, if we are going to do that particular part. So that is a lot in terms of considering the faulty revenue. Yeah, our revenue has been pegged to oil. We are all aware about how oil fluctuations have affected us in the past. We have in 2016 recorded a recession. In 2020, just because of the fluctuations in oil prices, that has been evident in our economy. So to navigate all those issues, there are ways that we need to go about it. We need to revive our revenue. How else do we want to solve revenue? How else do we want to source revenue rather? We have to source it from being a oil-reliant country to exploring others. We have the non-oil sector that has not been doing so well. because we're still exporting more private products. So we need to explore that. We need to go into exporting semi-finished and finished products.
All right, Ademido, I was asking the implications of all of this debt servicing obligation before we begin to even talk about exactly what's the implication for Nigeria. But let me say it. Analysts were concerned. Aside the ways and means, we have borrowed so much, even on the international market, from the World Bank, from the AFDB, and the likes. And the DMO has said that these are concessional loans. Of course, Nigeria has not defaulted in any way, right? Unlike some other countries like Ghana, like Zambia. But what's the implication of all of this for us?
Talking about debt, debt is not entirely bad because we've seen developed and developing countries also acquire debt. We have the likes of US having a debt to GDP ratio of around 123%. UK has over 100% debt to GDP ratio. Nigerians' debt to GDP is still is within the self-imposed limit of 40%, even the IMF limit of 55%. But why other countries that have a lot of debt don't have issues is because they have multiple sources of income. So they are not reliant on one source of income. So there is a sustainability plan for them to repay back the debt. So the implication for us is that there are concerns that as revenue is declining, how do you want to keep financing this debt? I think the debt servicing to revenue has actually increased. It was around 80%. That was in 2022. We have the IMF actually made a comment saying that it's even over 100%. I think 114%. That was what was quoted by IMF. So suggesting that we might have difficulties. That means that all the revenue we have is going to be going into servicing debt. And we will not have enough money to actually carry out some capital projects. That means that we still need to borrow more. So it has given us, it has kept us in a tight hole. That means we are using all the money, cutting all the revenues, but we are going to be using debt servicing. We are borrowing from international scene will be very, very difficult. We have investors are very peculiar about risk. So we have, for a country that has high risk and a possible default in case of if the trend of the debt continues to rise like that, that means that investors will naturally deter from a country like that. We cannot go to the Eurobond market. It's quite expensive. The rates are extremely high. So we have, even in terms of our grade, our credit rating has been downgraded to CA1. That is below investment grade. We have investors hardly invest in junk bonds. Going to the international scene to borrow, it's very difficult. We have to still bring us back to the problem of revenue. How do we solve revenue? How do we you can even continue to borrow, but let's use another strategy. Let us borrow against our assets. That's what we see in countries like Saudi Arabia, Malaysia. They borrow against their asset, not against your revenue. But the asset has to have a value. There's a valuation that we have to do to these assets that we have shown to the world, to investors, that they can invest in it and get back their funds.
All right, let me remind you that you could join us live on Twitter Spaces at WebTV-NG, on Facebook at WebTV-NG, and on YouTube at WebTV-NG. The conversation is ongoing, and we're looking at Buhari's debt legacy, high expenditure, low revenue. What must the Tinubu administration do to get Nigeria out of debt? So I have the DMO representative here. Mr. Monday Usaide is the Director, Market Development Department, as well as IMF representative as well. Is the resident representative, IMF Nigeria office. So, Mr. Oluwadare, maybe I should bring you in on the ways and means. I could see that you're also there. Kindly make a request to speak. But just before that, on the ways and means, this government has been able to argue that the reason for them dealing or asking the CBN to dole out a lot of monies as we have, they've blamed it on COVID, all of that. But let's get your take on all of this. In what ways has the federal government's borrowing violated the rules and regulations governing public borrowing, particularly the provisions of the CBN Act 2007?
The issues are really less about whether the borrowings are lawful or not, but it's more about the use of the loans. And this issue is related also. They are closely related, both the issue of borrowing and the use of the loan, which is why, for instance, the Fiscal Responsibility Act has provided clearly that the borrowings of government will be strictly for capital expenditure, capital projects, and that government shall undertake a cost benefits analysis, among other requirements, before any borrowing is done. So it is not that the CBN cannot borrow the federal government money, or whether the borrowing itself contravenes the provisions of the CBN Act, but there are other legislations that impact on that borrowing. So, for instance, there is securing the ways and means of over 21 trillion that the Nigerian government wants to do may not in itself be unlawful, but the question that Nigerians need to ask is, how was that loan secured? That is one. The second thing is, how was that loan used? And then the third is that, what is the basis and necessity for securing it as a public debt in this instance? But what we have seen with the experience that the Nigerian people have experienced with government, and within the context of this administration for the past 8 years, is that there is always a justification for borrowing legally, but in the reality of things, that is the impact of it on the average Nigerian, it doesn't impact on him or her, at least positively. And that also speaks to the provision of the Constitution, which is the ground norm, that says that the primary purpose of government is the welfare and security of the people. And don't forget, for every borrowing undertaken by the government, either through the CBN or even through any other means by external loans, they are still to be used for the welfare of the people. And so the question is, are Nigerians benefiting from the loans and the purported use of those loans? And I dare say the answer is in the negative. And that is what makes the borrowing unlawful in the first place, because the powers that we donate, that Nigerians have donated to the president and even to the governors who also borrow from time to time, is to be used in the interest of the people and for the benefit of the people. And one of those call it aids that guide the action of government is transparency and accountability, which is also one of the key aspects of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That is, government must be transparent in all its dealings, including the borrowing and the use of loans. And government must be accountable, including the use of our public resources. That is what Nigerians have not seen, which would appear to make Nigerians to be against borrowing. And so that point needs to be made clearly, that it is not the borrowing that is unlawful, but the purpose and the use of those loans. And antecedent had shown us as Nigerians that those loans, even when they appear to be justifiable by the reasons government had given, the use of those loans, of course, subsequently show that those loans were not necessary in the first place. And that leads to the issue. And I want to give a very brief example. The CCTV loans, the loan that was borrowed from the Chinese to finance putting CCTV in Abuja. We cannot see the CCTV. They just are not fixed, they're not working. Yet we are financing those loans. And you will recall when those loans wanted to be, of course, the reasons were genuine. It looks very plausible to beef up security in Abuja, and no one would challenge the necessity for such a loan. So it is not about the legality of taking those loans, but ultimately how those loans were used and the lack of transparency and accountability in the use and management of those loans. And that is the crux of the matter, at least on the point of view of Serap and the work that we do in advocacy for transparency and accountability. Thank you very much.
Well, let me still come back to these acts, Mr. Oluwadari, and Section 38, Article 2 of CBN Act states that the total amount of such advances outstanding shall not at any time exceed 5% of the previous year's actual revenue of the federal government. But on the contrary, over the last 8 years, the ways and means as a proportion of the previous year's revenue, I'm talking about 2014-2015 now, has grown from 23.06% in 2015 to a whopping 411.98% in 2022, which will make it very difficult for the coming administration to be able to actually borrow from the CBN. And the Act also states that that money must be paid before they can borrow. So what will be the next administration? I mean, Buhari would be leaving in just a few days to come. What must the next administration be doing in this regard? Because it looks like that threshold will be blocked.
Thank you very much. And so this kind of example you've given again speaks to the broader issue of good governance, transparency and accountability and impunity. You have cited the provision of the CBN Act, and that is not only the law that would even regulate the actions of government as based on income and expenditure, and in this instance, that of loans. But what we've seen is government deliberately or willfully disobey these provisions of the law from time to time, and even sometimes they take legal steps there to aid the legality that the government is doing. And that is what we've seen in 2020 and even in 2021. Part of the alterations and amendment proposed to the Finance Act was to amend some specific provisions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act to accommodate the growing GDP to debt ratio, which of course has a fixed percentage. And so again, it speaks to good governance, transparency, and accountability. So for the incoming administration, what they should and what I would expect them to do is to cut the ways that we've seen in the management of funds and not go the way of previous administrations who want to circumvent the provisions of our fiscal regulations, including the CBN Act and the Fiscal Responsibility Act and other laws, by amending the Finance Act from time to time that allows government to play around with issues, the rules that guide the actions of government, both in its income and expenditure. That would appear to be a tall order for what we've seen in public governance, but really that is the way to go for any government to buy the trust of the people.
Yeah, let me come back to you now. He has made some certain crucial points there, but looking at this issue of ways and means and the way it's been approved, even the lawmakers giving approval on securitization and all of that, and this is obviously going to affect domestic markets and investors in the domestic market. So how? What's the plan?
So thank you very much for the question. So let me start with the impact of the ways and means, the excessive ways and means on the economy. So that has been proven to be inflationary. So CBN just prints more money, which affects the economy. So gives more inflation. If it is more inflation, then it depreciates our currency more. Yeah, it has been flagged severally by IMF that we should cut down on our borrowings from CBN. And that has not been done so far. So, well, if you can just cut down on it, this new administration doesn't need to go through the route of the previous administration by going into ways and means borrowings again, because it will have inflationary impact on the country, which is already suffering from extremely high inflations. So you asked me you talked about how do you want them to go about it? So, how does it affect the market? That's discretization.
The domestic market.
Domestic market. So the style of the conversion to bond is quite different. It is not going to be in the market. It has been written by DMO that is going to be in the CBN account. So it's not going to be traded publicly. That means that we will not be seeing the crowding out of the market.
This conversation, the macroeconomic implications of injecting excess liquidity into the economy through ways and means, as well as external borrowings. Two questions in one I want to ask you. And what measures should be taken to address the violation of borrowing regulations in Nigeria?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So your two questions, I must begin by saying that there seems to be a distortion in the approach by the fiscal and monetary authorities to combat inflation. Quite recently, we had the central bank announcing a further increase in the MPR to around 18.5%. But unfortunately, MFLA's rigid stance on inflation, using the MPR as his sword, has been quite ineffective. Alongside that monetary control, there is a lot of money being pumped into the economy, into the real sector especially, and these have their impacts. The ways and means as another lump sum of monies, affected the economy in very, very significant ways, in the sense that it compounded the problem of inflation. A lot of these monies, according to the president, were used for infrastructure projects. Several of them were also given to the governors in the form of bailouts. And, to a very large extent, one can say that the federal system that Nigeria operates allows the center to provide these monies for the states. But the question then becomes, how productive is this money when it is given to the states? My colleague at Serap quite rightly pointed out that we have a transparency and accountability problem in the use of funds. It is extremely, extremely problematic at the level of the states. We have 36 states who only recently started using a unified framework for accounting, the National Chart of Accounts. So it's only quite recently that we began to know just how states were spending, what they were spending on, seeing their budgets, seeing their budget implementation reports. Lagos was the one that spearheaded that, and began to put out its budget implementation reports, quite ahead of the other states. And other states, then followed suit. But I will say that we cannot have these conversations about the impact of this excess liquidity without looking at the political nature of decision making and Nigerian governance in general.
So I was saying, what measures should be taken to address the violation of borrowing regulations to ensure greater fiscal responsibility? You mentioned Nigeria's monetary and fiscal policies in those areas.
So, this is the problem of consequence management. And, you ask yourself, in a theoretical state that has separation of powers like Nigeria does, a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive, who should hold the executive to account? It should be the legislature. The legislature should act as the check and balance in Nigeria. This is why we have a parliament. This is why we have a National Assembly. They not only make laws, but they are meant to provide oversight, for the executive, where the executive is unable to restrain itself. And that still takes me to the issue of rule of law. When you have a government that cannot tie its own hands to prevent itself from breaching its own rules, you have a rule by law, where the law to a very large extent applies to individual citizens, but is not applied to government officials and government decision making. The breach of these fiscal rules was a clear violation of statute that is written in black and white. But the authorities that have at least some level of oversight, let's even look at the executive authorities like the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, has not been empowered statutorily to clamp down on this spending by the executive. And the National Assembly that, through the doctrine of separation of powers, that should have stepped in to prevent, the federal government from increasing this ways and means borrowing, simply just folded its hands and watched while Rome burnt. And I think this really speaks more to our problem of consequence management and our appreciation of the role of finance, in public governance. These problems did not spring up from nowhere. They didn't happen overnight. They were as a result of deliberate policies that were unable to, rein in low productivity. So you have an oil sector that contributes, 10% to GDP. But this is responsible at the same time for 90% of forex and government revenues. People say, oh, we need to diversify the economy. The truth is the economy is already diversified. If you look at the figures put out by the NBS, the top 10 contributing activities to real GDP in Q1 2023, oil was not even, oil was number 4, but crop production, trade, telecoms were the top 3 performers, and construction has actually been, a high performer for a while. So there is low productivity. There's low productivity as a result of lack of structural transformation. How productive is the average Nigerian worker compared to, his peers all around the world? How efficient is...
I'm glad you talked about that, I'm glad you talked about that, talking about Nigerians. Just before I bring in the authorities, the DMO, and I'm told that, all right, Mr. Isen would like you to invite and join with your phone. Maybe we'll get to hear you from there. So, Vala, you were talking about Nigerians. Now, how do Nigerians make sense of all that we are talking about? Let's break it down and let's bring it home. An average Nigerian earning the income wage is at what now? Ademidu?
It's around 30,000.
Around 30,000. What sense can Nigerians make out of this? Nigerians joining us, you can also send in your questions and comments in the comment section. But let us get to hear it. What does this mean for them?
I mean, this means that things are most likely going to get worse before they get better. You know, it's interesting that you talked about minimum wage. That applies to public sector workers. And what we should be looking at is gross national income, or at least per capita income, to really know what Nigerians are spending, or perhaps even the modal income, as opposed to the arithmetic mean. So for the average Nigerian, it means that things are going to get more expensive. It means that the government is going to scramble to extract more taxes. You know, quite recently, we've seen the use of the electronic money transfer levies that the federal government has been, extracting from Nigerians that make use of telecommunications services, mobile telephony and all that. And we've seen increases in those charges. And this simply means that, while the federal government is battling with a precarious oil sector, I mean, our oil production volumes, have only just begun to improve after falling quite significantly. But while they're battling with, the oil sector and their inability to properly structure it, there's also going to be a move by the government to tax Nigerians more. And this is critical, especially at a time when we have over 133 million Nigerians living in poverty. So it means that we need to engage deeper with politicians, especially those in the houses of assembly at the state and at the federal level. It means we need to, engage more with elected officials, in the executive, write to them, speak to them, demand answers, demand data, demand, explanations for why they take economic decisions. It's one thing for you to have a government. It's another thing for you to know how it is run. I think now more than ever, Nigerians need to step into that driver's seat and demand accountability.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that's not a news that many Nigerians would want to hear, that is going to be worse. It's already worse. How more worse could it get? So let's talk to the DMO here. He has joined us. Kindly make a request to speak. Mr. Monday Usaide, would really love to hear from you. The Debt Management Office and the role of the DMO as regards this debt servicing, where we are with debt, with incurring debts at the moment, and the ways and means. So what's the role of the DMO in all of this?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting the DMO to join this discussion. I had initial issues in joining, and I'm sure you can hear me right now. The role of the DMO is very clear. The act establishing the DMO is very clear on its functions and on its roles. We are the agency managing Nigerian debt. What we do is we receive approvals from the authorities based on the difference between revenue provision and expenditure and the amount that is to be borrowed, either externally or domestically. And the DMO goes about performing this function. And so we are the service end of the curve, and our job is simply to look at the best way, the options that we have, sources, amounts, and all that we can put together to fund government as approved by the authorities. So that's basically what we do. Our act is very clear. The FRO is also very clear on our rules. And this we have tried to do over the years, and we have been able to keep Nigerians abreast of our activities. All the debt data are made public, and if there's any agency that has been very transparent in issues, I think the DMO deserves commendation. That everything you need to know about debt is in the public domain. And that is why we always love it when Nigerians speak about it, which means they're following the trend, the data, the implications, and all that. And everyone who has spoken based on the understanding of the data that are out there. So we want to commend everyone has made contributions and continue to make contributions. We remain very clear on our mandate, and we're going to do our best to inform Nigerians on the borrowings that are going on
All right, so while we commend you, for giving us the facts and the figures, we also expect to also ask questions. And recently, the GG, Patience Oniha, questioned the media about their reports. And she actually said, okay, the figures you doled out are right. And currently, Nigeria finds it difficult to get external loans. That's what she says. And she cited why. She said because of the adverse impact of the Ukraine-Russian war, as well as the high interest rate environment in the international capital market. So it's going to be very difficult. And on the side, we have the ways and means issues. It looks like the government has gone beyond the limit to borrow. So what is the DMO doing in this regard? You're expected to manage. How are you going to be managing this area? If we cannot borrow internationally and locally, there's also some sort of difficulty.
Thank you for your questions. The issue about the media and debt narrative, I think the perspective should be that I like the heading of this discussion, expenditure, debt, and all that. I think that is where we should. When for the primary basis for debt is that the government sits down and say, I have an expenditure to make and I have a revenue to collect. The difference between it is what leads to debt. Like every other individual, that's how it works. So we should be focused more on how to make the expenditure and revenue, okay, to the gap should be as narrow as possible for you to limit borrowing. It's just as simple as that. And you still have to incur, you have to probably borrow or sell your assets or do some other things to meet that gap. So the issue here is not more for us. The issue here is the equation that leads to debt. How do we look at the indicators there and manage them so that we reduce the amount which we borrow? The other side to it is saying that the market is closed, we can't raise money. I don't think it's entirely correct. I'm not sure you are quoting the DG rightly. The issue here is that the international market, we have restrictions in terms of pricing. If you want to go there to pick money at double digits in the high range, you will get money because you have to pay a premium. So it's not as if the market is completely closed. What you have is restriction in access based on your ratings and the cost of borrowing. And I don't think we who are at the end of managing debt, I don't think I will advise the federal government to say, go to the international capital market and borrow at 15, 17%. No, that is not the issue. So and when you come to the local market, we have been able to raise substantially. So we have in the art, new domestic borrowing, new external borrowing. Please let me remind us that it is not just truly Eurobonds for which you raise money externally. It is just one of the sources. So depending on availability from the multilateral, from the bilateral, from the export credit, we explore all those options to see how we can raise the external component. Some of them don't come really in time as and when needed, but those options are there. So we cannot entirely say that the international market is close to Nigeria. No. The fact is that if you want to borrow there's money available at a given cost, and it's the whether you want to take it or not. So I want to say sincerely yours that the DMO will continue to exploit all the options of raising money that's at very low level of cost where available, and in terms of data and information to Nigerians, we'll continue to provide as much as we could. Thank you.
Thank you. If I get you correctly, it is wiser to borrow on the international market, especially from the World Bank, IMF, AFDB. The concession there are quite okay, if that's what you're saying.
Yes, what I'm saying is that there are, beside the Eurobond, there are, if you look at our external debt stocks, you see several sources of borrowing. You see multilateral, you see the World Bank Group, African Development Bank, you see bilateral, and you see commercial. So it's not just the commercial window that will have access to borrow from the international market. There are several other options. So that's the point I was trying to raise.
All right, thank you so much for clearing that out. Unfortunately, the ballooning debt keeps affecting the revenue generation. Debt to revenue has risen up to about 81% as of 2022. And from 2015 to 2022, domestic debt servicing was about 13.68 trillion naira, while that of external debt servicing is about 2.41 billion naira. Now that is the issue. Our revenue cannot alone service our debts because we keep having this budget deficit and all of that. So where do we go from here? We're looking at how we can find a solution for the incoming administration. So maybe I should bring in back budget. Viola, maybe you want to give us a way, or probably if you are in the position to tell the Tinubu administration what to do, what should he be doing? I think revenue is the way to go, right? Revenue generation. But at the moment, where are we generating revenue? And what is that other thing that this incoming administration should be doing to generate revenue, aside these places that we have gone to and probably burnt our fingers?
Yes, so I mean the highest contributors to gross domestic product, at least for the first quarter of 2023, telecoms, agriculture, of course, oil and gas comes around number 4. So the incoming administration needs to sort out how it can increase the output per worker and improve the environment that productivity can translate to not just higher output, but higher profits for firms, so that the government can, of course, tax them in the way they should. So this would mean that the investments, the public infrastructure, the credit, that should be made available for firms and for businesses really needs to be reorganized in ways that it's going after already existing productive bases. You cannot hope your way out of poverty, but there needs to be some identification of those sectors, whether they be manufacturing or technology or telecommunications or construction, that not only can serve as a means to create a more diversified export base, but also for improvements in value additions for commodities or services that can be traded within Nigeria. And I think this is really where the government misses it. In addition to serious misalignment in terms of planning and strategy between the center and the subnational units, I mean that these are, tiers of government that are unable to plan together and maximize the scarce resources that they have. In addition to all sorts of problems surrounding our multiple foreign exchange windows and, the subsidy that needs to be removed, I think that Tinubu and his administration would really need to sit down and, make their plans very clear. They have very limited time. 4 years may not really be long enough, for the type of growth that Nigeria needs to see. Looking at the fact that, we have far more people living in multidimensional poverty than we ever have had. We have a revenue to GDP ratio that is around 6%, which is probably the lowest, for a country like Nigeria. So in short, I will say that the sectors that have been identified as drivers of the economy, moving away from oil and gas production, have to be enhanced. And this would require not just policies, this would require some diligence and detail on the part of the government to ensure that the way that credit finds its way to firms is done transparently. The infrastructure necessary for firms to improve their productivity, energy, and transport also need to be adequately addressed. It's fortunate that the president was able to sign the bill that has now brought electricity generation to the states, to the concurrent list. And I remarked quite recently on Twitter that I hope now that Nigerian citizens will take their state governors to task, because now you cannot only just blame the federal government for not having light, but you can also blame your state government. So I think in summary, those are some of the things that we need to look at and really unpacking the problems with enhancing productivity, whether it be issues with market imperfections or policy and regulation. The government really needs to critically take a look at Nigeria's ease of doing business and ensure that the drivers are addressed and those things that drag businesses down are eliminated.
Thank you so much for that, for those thoughts you shared there on solutions. And you made mentions of so many sectors that the government could be looking at when it comes to revenue generation, especially ease of doing business. I'm sure that's what Nigerians would want to hear here. Ease of doing business, having constant power supply, and the states will be called accountable with the laws that have just been signed. And you talked about diligence, details and transparency with the next administration coming up. Mr. Oluwadare, I don't know if you're still there, but if you're there, Serap is known for accountability, driving towards transparency and holding the government accountable. So if I'm going to be asking you, what measures should be taken to address the violation of borrowing regulations and ensure that there is greater fiscal responsibility, especially with this coming administration?
Thank you very much. Before I go to what you've spoken about, I'd like to briefly say that while I would understand from the economic point of view, we might have a revenue challenge. I think from the citizens' point of view, who are the right holders in this instance, will be at the brunt of the economic policies of government, whether they are good or bad. It is more of a management challenge. What is the essence of having good revenue, a good economy, that what we see as the benefits have been frittered away by government? And that is where good governance comes in. Well, good governance might look like a simple phrase, but it captures a lot. It speaks to transparency and accountability. It speaks to management of public funds. It speaks to cutting waste. So, for instance, just for context, in 2019, and there is this practice called security votes, for instance. In 2019, the total security vote spent was 241 billion naira. And that is higher than the Nigerian Army's budget for that year, which was just 155 billion. And that is just an aspect. It is more than the combined budget of the Navy and the Air Force for that year, which was just 189 billion. So what is the essence of having more revenue when we are not sure we are going to manage it well? And then it would end up being wasted, and the citizens will become more poorer than it is. In less than a week now, 22 states in Nigeria will pay pension to former governors and deputy governors. And the least state that would pay, the least a state will pay to each one of them will be 500 million naira. Some run into billions of naira. And that is still from money that is being generated. That is not enough. So I would say it is a matter of management. And that also means that these practices must be cut. And the expenses spent on presidential trips, the state house budgets, and even the National Assembly by use of statutory transfers. The National Assembly got over 200 billion this year. How much are they going to get next year? And this is the same National Assembly that got over 30 billion naira to renovate the National Assembly complex last year. And so these are the issues you must look into. If not, this will translate to good economic measures that look good on paper at any rate, but as to the impact on the citizens, it would really be minimal, if not in the negative. And as to the transparency measures that the incoming administration should take in line with the provisions of the law, it is very important that we talk about adherence to the rule of law. What is the use of good advice given to government? What is the benefit of advocacy that Serap is doing, and people on this call, including well-meaning Nigerians, have been doing to government, if government refuses to obey the law of the land? And the laws are very clear. The CBN Act is very clear as to the role of CBN as a borrower to the federal government, and as to the responsibility or duties of the federal government as the borrower, and as the CBN as a lender. But what is the use of government that decides to toe the path of impunity? It makes those laws look useless. So it is not enough to talk about those laws or making new laws. It is to get the commitment of government. And that commitment is not gotten only at the ballot. It is gotten now, when they are about to come in, when they are in, and whenever they are going out, that Nigerians take them out to task to follow follow the laws. But before Nigerians can successfully and effectively advocate for good governance, they must, as right holders, understand what the law says. What is the right and obligations of myself as a citizen and that of the president down to the councillor and the government. And that is why we can now advocate that, Mr. President, the CBN Act says you must not do this. The Fiscal Responsibility Act says you must not do this. The Finance Act says you must do this and you must not do this. And then we're able to hold them to account. Again, I would like to emphasize, it is not enough to complain about the laws. The laws are not perfect. But impunity is what we have seen that has made government disobey the laws at will and get away with it. Unfortunately, the citizens continue to bear the brunt while we continue to have wonderful advocacy discussions like this that really reap little or no benefits for the citizen because the government is just not ready to obey its laws. And then, in the simplest of terms, these laws are clear. Government must follow the laid down procedures in both revenue generation, including borrowing, and in expenditure. That is very important. And that will be our advice of Serap to the incoming administration.
Thank you so much, Mr. Oluwadari, for sharing your thoughts there. Mr. Isen, the IMF is with us, and the IMF has been quite vocal about Nigeria's spending and revenue generation. And I know that the representative has been listening to us. Kindly join us and make a request to speak via your phone. I'm sure we'll be able to hear you via your phone. If you make a request to speak through your phone, please do that, and would love to hear your thoughts before we close the conversation. So, Mr. Monday, let me come back to you. The budget person has been able to speak about how Nigeria can generate generation, talking about the incoming administration. Mr. Oluwadari has also been able to tell us how best the government can be held accountable. Governance is very, very important. The laws are there. They may not be perfect, that's what he has said, but implementation is very, very key. So now you are on the part of the government. What would you be doing to make this incoming administration a better one in the role of management of the debt office?
Let me first say that I'm very pleased to be here and hearing this discussion, which is extremely important. What we heard from the debt management office is very, very accurate and very clear that in order to resolve the debt issue of Nigeria, you need to concentrate on revenues and expenditures. The DMO is just trying to do its best in terms of financing at its best, cheapest possible way, everything that is received in terms of spending needs or financing needs of the government. I think this issue should be very, very clear. Otherwise, we get distracted and not very clear about the diagnostic, why the debt position has deteriorated. The debt position has deteriorated because the government is spending more than is actually getting in revenues. As simple as that. So how do you reduce the spending needs of the government? That should be the question when we ask about the debt issue in Nigeria. And there, it's not only about the laws, but it's really about fiscal discipline. And fiscal discipline requires, as in any household, that you cannot permanently spend beyond what you raise in revenues, simply because it becomes unsustainable. Eventually, someone will come and ask the money back. And someone will come and say, you know, enough, I'm not financing anymore. So what is critical to do is to be able to rely more on your own revenues to finance your own expenditures. That is the autonomy and independence that we would like to see our member countries be able to rely on. So the question for Nigeria is, the budget is very small. And in fact, spending should be even increased if possible, particularly in social areas. Of course, very efficient, with good governance, good use of funds. That goes without saying. But the issue of revenue is existential for Nigeria. Because on one hand, you need more revenues to be able to make social spending and infrastructure that is efficient, but you also need more revenues to avoid having to get financing from the central bank, which is extremely inflationary. I'm referring to the ways and means. So the revenue piece in all this is existential for Nigeria to achieve macroeconomic stability, reduce inflation, and rein in on the liquidity in the market on one hand, and on the other hand, raise resources to spend properly on good spending, efficient spending that will contribute to inclusive growth, creation of employment, infrastructure, health, education, social protection. So this is the challenge for Nigeria. Now, I heard very well Budget and Serap. We interact very often, and I'm very grateful to their views, which are extremely important. One critical aspect for Nigeria, and we see that in many, many countries, is that the willingness of corporations, individuals to pay their taxes goes hand in hand with good governance and use of funds. So there is an implicit social contract between government and citizens that requires that some will, the people will pay their taxes and the government will make good use of those funds. That social contract needs to be strengthened. One aspect of it, you cannot rely only on few corporations paying the entire tax bill. Equity, bringing everyone into the net to contribute to the tax effort, is essential. Because if I see that I am the only one who pays taxes, I will try to avoid as much as I can. It's very important to get the social contract. Equity in tax payments is very important to broaden the tax base so everyone can pay their due share. That's one aspect of tax administration that is very important. It's also important on the VAT that VAT refunds can be given. If I do not get VAT refunds, my likelihood or willingness to pay the VAT declines. So VAT refunds on inputs for the manufacturing and other segments of the economy sectors needs to work as a VAT, and the refunds should be given back. That's not the current practice of returning the refunds to inputs. So a lot of tax administration effort, we are contributing, putting training and capacity building at FIRS, customs, and with all the institutions that handle tax administration and tax policy to really inspire a change in the way tax collections can improve in Nigeria. Someone mentioned in this call that Nigeria has about 6-7% of GDP in tax revenues. That is very little. That's among the lowest in the world. And we have some studies internally at the IMF that shows that if you have a tax to GDP ratio below 12.75% of GDP, there is an analytical piece showing this. If you have less than that, it's not possible to make a meaningful change in social indicators, social development indicators. So if we want to be reducing poverty and improving the lives of the lots of Nigerians, we need a higher revenue generation. And of course, that should go hand in hand with good use of fiscal funds. That is my contribution for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that deep insight there. Talking about spending more than revenue that the government has been doing, and the government has to cut spending and generate more. And if we have to spend at all, you talked about those areas where we need to spend. You talked about the tax administration efforts, talking about also that if Nigerians, I'm sure a lot of Nigerians listening to us today would be glad in that area. If Nigerians see where their taxes are being deployed, I'm sure they'll be glad to pay more. But if they are not seeing it, then they wouldn't want to pay more. So you talked about those areas, but let me get your take on this and your advice to the government, the incoming administration. So if they are going to be cutting spending, in what areas would they be cut? Should they be cutting spending?
Okay, the primary area, and I think most of the people have given this advice, is to eliminate the fuel subsidies. Fuel subsidies are hugely expensive. They cost last year 2% of GDP. You cannot sustain that type of spending for a long time. And this is a spending item that is not benefiting the most vulnerable in the country. This spending is actually benefiting the richest, those with large cars. Of course, some vulnerable people and the middle class may suffer, and we need to think about how to compensate them, particularly those users of urban transport. But again, the social contract and the consensus in society must be on a reflection. Is this the use of scarce resources? If we are raising taxes to finance fuel subsidies, or worse, you are asking the central bank for financing through overdraft, ways and means that are inflationary, who is paying because of the inflation? Are the poorest, the most vulnerable. So it's, I call it in many ways, the reverse. It's that the poor are financing the rich because you are paying the inflation tax because you hold those cash balances every day. So you are paying a high inflation rate. Why? To sustain subsidies that are very regressive, that are benefiting the rich. So this is like the reverse of what one would expect. It's double regressive. We need more progressive tax and subsidy system. So my advice, and we have been giving this advice, few subsidies must go. Of course, protecting, thinking about ways through cash transfers, and some other international organizations have been working closely with the authorities on that to be able to compensate and make it more visible the contribution of the fiscal authorities to the people, so people can accept in a compact, in a consensus, building the social contract, the elimination of the few subsidies that Nigeria has tried in the past. And hopefully it will succeed with the new administration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure Nigerians listening to us at this moment would also want to share their comments, their questions, their observations. So kindly request to speak, and would allow two more questions here. But just before they make that request to speak, Ademidu, let me come to you. Ademidu is the economist with Proshare, and she's in the studio with me. If you're going to be advising the Tinubu administration coming in just a few days, especially on the economy of Nigeria, where is that one or two things that you will be asking him to look at? Mr. Eisen did mention that fuel subsidy must go. I'm very sure many Nigerians wouldn't mind if there are alternatives on ground. Yes, the commissioning of Dangote refinery was done just, is it 2 days ago now? So, but I mean, is that a succor for Nigerians? So what would you be telling the administration to look at, especially when it comes to economy?
Thank you very much for the question. Okay, when it comes to the economy at large, I think, as we've been talking about the revenue generation, how we need to address our sources of revenue. So let's start with the current sources of revenue. So let's look at oil. We have oil, the oil that's been our main reliant in terms of our FX exchange, foreign FX. But the problem is that we still have problem in terms of the crude oil production. It declined so much last year. Yes, we have because of underlying issues. We have the issue of oil theft, and it's still a major problem now because the production, daily production as of March was still around 1 million, which is quite low compared to the capacity that we have. So the incoming administration needs to focus on the oil theft. How do we want to tackle these things? We have the current administration as we have the private contractor taking care of that, but has it been effective? Which everybody agrees that it's not, because our production power has still not really improved. And how do we intend to fund our budgets? Because the budget has an assumption that our daily production will be around 1.6 million daily per month. So daily rather. So with that, how do we want to meet that to be able to source for our revenue, for the right revenue that we have? Another issue with the incoming administration needs to settle is about the tax itself. So we're talking about tax collection. Nigeria is known to have a very large informal sector. Our informal sector accounts for like 65% of the total economy. So have these people been able to pay tax? There's an argument that the informal sector pays tax, but they pay it in cash to those their unions. How are the FIRS collecting this tax? In the last report in 2022, they said that we have the total collection amounted to 10 trillion, which is actually an achievement. But this still gives us that there is an opportunity for us to actually get more tax. So how do we eradicate tax evasion? We have the sectors. How are we going to collect this money from people that are collecting this money? We have every normal business in Nigeria, small scale business has a unit that they pay cash to as taxes. How are we going to collect that? So we need to address that. We need to adopt technology. Technology will be very good in terms of tax collection.
Right. Thank you so much, Ademido. You talked about oil theft must be handled, tax collection, as well as technology. So let me get the closing remarks from everyone before we go. Your closing remark, what would be your advice? Or, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you to everyone listening. The challenge of governance is one that will never go away until Nigerian leadership and followership is able to understand that there is a critical urgency needed to keep everyone accountable, regardless of your ethnic group or your religious affiliation. The problems of Nigeria's economy, the problems of Nigeria's governance are things that did not arrive overnight. There are things for which a lot of research in the public domain already exists. I would ask the incoming government to utilize data and ensure that it carries Nigerians along at every step of the way in the decisions that it makes. It refrains from, the age-old problems that this current administration brought up in terms of a mismatch between fiscal and monetary authority, where you have a central bank that's basically providing credit, which is a thing I do not think it is designed to do, to the real sector, which has created a lot of excess liquidity. You have a lot of spending on security and infrastructure without adequate measurement of just how effective that money has been used. You have a mismatch between the states and the federation in terms of how they spend their monies. You have Nigerian states that generate basically 11 to 12% of total government revenues, while they spend over 30% on expenditure, not even on capital expenditure. So, these are questions, these are conversations that we need to have. And, finally, we need to ensure that we understand our role as citizens in holding elected officials to account, whether they be at the federal level or at the state level or at the local government level. Talk to these people, get their phone numbers, send them emails, question them when you can, of course, in legal means, and, play your role as a citizen of this country. Thank you.
So much, Nigerians. The government, the incoming administration must utilize data, communicate with Nigerians, and Nigerians must also hold them accountable, ask questions. Let's hear from you, Mr. Oluwadare.
I would speak to the Nigerian citizens as right holders to continue with the same favor, possibly with a bit much more than we've seen in the last elections, to engage government in lawful advocacy for good governance. And that is beyond the rather pedestrian views of tribe, religion, and politics, to see good governance as not only a right provided by law, but a natural right as part of aspects of good governance. And I believe that if we engage really within this perspective, it would be really beneficial for us as citizens, whether in the short term or in the long run. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we're so glad to hear from our contributors and an analyst in the studio. Would have loved to hear from you. Nigerians listening to us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube, it would have been a very good one to hear your own side, because this is all about you. And a new administration will be coming in just in a few days. I'm sure a lot of Nigerians just want good governance, want that administration that would bring that change that we all have been aching for. But thank you so much. It was an interesting conversation. Sharing with our contributors. And I would really love to thank all of you, Mr. Vayala Kwaga, who is the Senior Research and Policy Analyst with Budget, Director, Market Development Department, DMO, Mr. Monde Usaide. Thank you so much for joining us. The Deputy Director, Serap Nigeria, as well as the Resident Representative, IMF Nigeria Office, Mr. Ari Isen. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been very insightful with us here at Web TV. Thank you so much. My name is Yemisi Lanredo. I'll see you again.